by the way, this transition in leadership happens over the course of about a year. So you go from Josiah to one of the worst kings of the nation of Judah. All within the course of a very short period of time. And Habakkuk is stuck right in the middle of this, and he sees the Babylonian invasion coming, and he sees that they're going to triumph. They're going to invade 3 times, according to Scripture, and the final time that they invade, the only people that are going to be left are the poorest of the land. They're going to pluck out the ruling king's eyes and kill his sons in front of him and drag everybody else off to Babylon. That's the violence that Habakkuk is foreseeing. And we know that in an archetypal sense, Babylon represents the world in Scripture. You know, when we sing Babylon has fallen, I always used to think as a little guy, you know, maybe 6 or 7 years old, when I started listening to the words of hymns, why are we singing about Babylon? Because we understand that when we sing of Babylon, we're singing of Jesus Christ's triumph over the world. Because Babylon is in Scripture, represents the world. And so the world, in Babylon in this case, invades the land of the people of God. And it's victorious. And, you know, in this greater sense, Habakkuk is speaking of a theme that we see echoed throughout Scripture, which is that the world wages war against God's church. The world is not interested in the perpetuity of God's church. And so many, many times we see Babylon up in arms against God's church. And yes, within our own frail, limited mindsets, it often seems as if Babylon might triumph. That we might be hauled off into captivity. That the church might succumb to evil. That the church might succumb to Babylon. And yes, I would dare say that in many cases, when I read the cases of martyrs throughout the history of the early church, it seems that in those cases, the world triumphed. It took their lives. You know, as we look at secular conflicts, that's sort of quite literally, metaphorically and literally, the final death blow. That many martyrs in the history of the early church lost their lives at the hands of God's enemies. And Habakkuk is dealing with a similar type of quandary here, where he's looking out at the reign of Jehoiakim. He's looking out at the evil acts of the king of Judah, and he's wondering how all of this could be unfolding while God is in heaven. He says, "How long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear?" Habakkuk says, "I've prayed, I've asked, I've beseeched the Lord, and it seems as if he's not listening. I've seen iniquity, I've beheld grievance, spoiling and violence are before me. And there are that raise up strife and contention." He says, "Therefore the law is slacked." This is, what an interesting statement for a prophet of God to make. That he would even dare to say that the law, the seemingly inexorable judgment of the law, is slacked in his days, and judgment doth never go forth. He's asking, when is this wickedness going to be punished? Because it doesn't seem as if anything is happening. He says, "For the wicked doth compass about the righteous, therefore wrong judgment proceedeth." Habakkuk says, and this is quite a daring thing to state, that he doesn't think and he doesn't feel that the world is being judged appropriately. And yes, I do think that he is stating this before God. He does not think that the world is being dealt with appropriately by God. And if you've thought deeply about the issues that afflict the world, if you've thought deeply about what it means for there to be wickedness in the world, I would say that you probably made similar statements to yourself. At least I have. We've made similar statements to ourselves. Where is judgment? Where is judgment? Now, and Habakkuk reports that he understands, the Lord's revealed to him that the Babylonian nation is going to be raised up. and they're going to execute judgment against Judah for their disobedience. And we understand that the Babylonian nation did so in a very, very violent way. Very, very violent, as we've already mentioned. And the kingdom of Judah is no more. Kingdom of Judah is no more. Only the poor are left there in the land. And their king has been dragged off to Babylon, blinded in both of his eyes. His descendants have been murdered in front of him. So there is no more line to rule over the land of Judah. And yes, it does seem as if evil finally has the upper hand. As if the Babylonian nation has finally gained the upper hand and has completely overthrown Judah. And Habakkuk is simply asking this question: how will I bear this? How do I square this with what I understand about God? How do I square this with what I understand about the nation of Judah? How can I reconcile the fact that we're told that in verse 6, lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that is God. God raised up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. And he goes on and gives a frightening description of Babylon's might in war. And yes, they come and they do exactly what the Lord had revealed to Habakkuk that they would do. How does Habakkuk deal with this? And I dare to say, how do we deal with the quandary that David frequently wrestled with? That the wicked seem to prevail over the righteous. How do we deal with the quandary? And I often deal with this quandary when I see a church close its doors. I'll be less abstract about this and very specific with you all this morning, and I trust this of the Lord. I deal with the exact thoughts that Habakkuk is expressing here when I see a church close its doors. The world seems to have finally won out against some small congregation of God's people somewhere when a church finally closes its doors in finality. I've seen this. I haven't been alive very long, and I've seen this many, many times in this day and age, that a church closes its doors and it doesn't meet anymore. How heartbreaking is that when we see it? How do we deal with this? Well, here's how Habakkuk addresses this quandary. And it's, sometimes to my rational mind, not quite satisfactory. But I believe it's true. It's the only option we have, dare I say, to grapple with some of these realities when we see the wicked seeming to triumph over the righteous. Here's what Habakkuk says. After he's finished outlining the ferocity and seemingly unconquerable nature of the Babylonian armies, he says this in chapter 2. He says, I will stand upon my watch. I will stand upon my watch. Here's the image that Habakkuk is evoking here. Here's what he's trying to say. He says, I am a watchman standing on the wall of a great city. And far off in the distance, I hear the rumbling of chariots. I hear the stomping of feet. And I see that indeed it is time, and the Babylonian army has arrayed themselves against the people of God. And they're coming to vanquish our city. And a choice lies before Habakkuk in this analogy. He can either continue to stand faithful upon his watch, or he can flee in fear. What is he going to do? Habakkuk, in his faith and his steadfastness, he says, I will stand upon my watch. That is, even when I see the glinting of spears over the crest of the hill, even when I hear the rumbling of chariots, even when I see the ferocity of the Babylonian army rising up against my city, I will not leave my post. And I'm here to tell you today, child of God, when we see the world when we see the secular world rising up in force against the church of God, there is an option presented to us. Do we run in fear, or do we stand firm upon our watch? And based on the example of Habakkuk today, that even when the forces of darkness seem to array themselves against the church of God, the only option of the child of God is to stand fast upon our watch, upon the wall of this great city that is the church of God. And Habakkuk was able to do this because of the understanding that he had of these conflicts, not by his own reason, not because he was just a smart guy, because of this understanding that he had by faith. And this is a concept that boggles some modern theologians' minds, because they think that faith was really only useful somehow in the New Testament. I assure you today that even Habakkuk, an Old Testament prophet, references his faith. And he says, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. He says, I'm going to stand fast, and I'm going to wait for the Lord's answer to this conflict that I'm wrestling with in my own mind. I'm going to see what the Lord has to say. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain upon the tables, that he may run that readeth. He says, Habakkuk, I want you to write this down so that people in the future can understand what I told to you. He seemed to have done that, because we're reading it thousands of years later. He says, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie, though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. That is, the Lord tells Habakkuk the resolution, the answers to these questions that you are asking will not come now, and they may not come in the timeline that you will like, but they will come. He says, behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith. That is, the just shall live, he says, behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Thank you. I'm subconsciously quoting Romans chapter 1, and we have to avoid not to do that in this case. That is, the Lord doesn't view those who think they have it all figured out very favorably. And I think, particularly when we start thinking about the end times, as the eschatology of the church, if you will, as it's discussed by Habakkuk in the next chapter, we understand that there are many people who look at issues like this and think they have it all figured out. That is the person whose soul is lifted up in them. And I think that manifests itself in many, many different forms. In the modern age, we see people who think they can precisely pinpoint the second return of Jesus Christ. We think there are people in the world who think that some of the wickedness in the world that is solely a consequence of the sin of Adam in the Garden of Eden is somehow intertwined in this mysterious, overarching plan of God that none of us, look, we can't figure some of this stuff out. And dare I say that God doesn't view those who think they have all of this conflict between good and evil sorted out to a T very favorably. But God does view those who choose to live by their faith favorably. I want to submit to you this morning is it's by faith, it's by his faith that Habakkuk is able to sort out how to live by faith, and also understand that the Lord's judgment finally triumphs over the evil that he observed in his day. He understands that by faith. This is chapter 3, and again, we're going to have to move quickly here and pick up on what Habakkuk is trying to say here. Chapter 3 and verse 2. Habakkuk says, O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. What an amazing statement to make. What an amazing prayer. In the midst of the years make known, in wrath remember mercy. Here's what he says. God from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah, his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Habakkuk's not speaking of the days in which he lived. He's not speaking of the circumstances that he observed when he looked around him and saw the chaos that was unfolding in the nation of Judah. He's speaking of a time in the future, a different time. It says, and his brightness was as the light. He had horns coming out of his hand, and there was the hiding of his power. Before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet. This isn't a pleasant picture. Now, again, it's beautiful, but for the wicked, this isn't a pleasant depiction of God. It speaks of God coming forth in his judgment. Pestilence, burning coals. Are you sensing that imagery? And furthermore, when it says that God comes from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran, it's evoking this word picture of the sun breaking over the horizon and casting the entire earth in sunshine. And God appears as such in his judgment. This is, I submit to you this morning, and you're welcome to disagree with me. This is exactly what Habakkuk wanted to see in his day. Where is God with the pestilence? Where is God with the burning coals? Where is God with the horns and his coming out of his hand? Where is he? Where is the judgment? Where is the judgment on this evil that he's observing in his day? And he's not seeing it. But yeah, I submit to you that he believes that it is coming by faith. He believes that this judgment of God is going to unfold by faith. Now, let's do our best to tie this to the New Testament. We're going to do so by reading from 1 John chapter 5. Very familiar verse of Scripture here. Here's the perspective that we ought to have. Here's the perspective that we ought to have toward these things. The evil that we see unfolding around us, the wickedness that seems to prevail, the controversy that David highlights, that the wicked seem to be prospering, but the righteous seem to be withering. Here's the perspective that we have. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 4. For whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world. And this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. And here's the truth that's communicated to us by faith. We believe it by faith. We embrace it hopefully by faith. That the child of God is not abstract. This is you and I. The born-again child of God does overcome the world. The martyrs that we read about in the days of the early church, and I would encourage you to do that. And you don't have to leave Scripture in order to read about those people. You can read Hebrews chapter 11. That's sufficient. Those people, mysteriously, overcame the world. They didn't overcome it by intellect. They didn't overcome it by political savvy. They didn't overcome it because they had more chariots than the enemy. They didn't overcome it because they were of great affluence and rhetoric. They overcame it by faith. He says, and this is the victory that overcometh the world. What is the victory that overcometh the world? Bated breath. If someone was reading this to me, as I trust this letter was read in the early church, I would have been on the edge of my seat. Tell me what overcomes the world. Even our faith is what overcomes the world. And you say, brother, how is it that our faith overcomes the world? Child of God, it's because faith points to a time where evil will not be triumphant, but rather it will be crushed fully and finally under the weight of God's judgment. You say, where is God descending? Where is he like the rising sun appearing in his judgment? It is coming. Not in the timeline that we would like, Not exactly what we would expect, but we believe that that time is coming by faith. There's going to be a great victory in that day that's finally won out. Yes, against the people that perpetuated evil in the days of Habakkuk, that the Lord had not redeemed. There's going to be a victory executed against those. There's going to be a victory executed against people that perpetuate evil in our day, that lie in wait to shed innocent blood. All of these evils that we see will be laid to rest fully and finally one day. And it is truly this expectation, this hope, that allows us to bear what is to me this existential and often crippling weight of looking about the world and seeing terrible things happen. That one day all of this will finally be laid to rest. Last passage that we're going to visit, Hebrews chapter 6. I think this is particularly important here. You know, I think we live in a rationalistic society, meaning that we tend to try to view the world through the lens of our intellect and as our natural mind, to use the words of Paul to the Corinthian church. And as a consequence, I think we tend to undersell the critical importance of faith in the born-again child of God's life, particularly among denominations outside of the Old Baptist. But we rejoice in faith here this morning, understand that it's of critical and indispensable importance to the child of God. And here's what Paul says. This is verse 13. He says, "For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself." God swears by himself. He himself is the assurance of his promise. He says, saying, "Surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee." And so, after he'd patiently endured, he obtained the promise. That is, the assurance that the Lord provided to Abraham didn't unfold immediately as perhaps Abraham would have liked. That is, I'm more of a creature that's oriented toward instant gratification rather than delayed gratification. I want things now, I don't want things later. But the promise that the Lord delivered to Abraham didn't necessarily unfold within Abraham's preferred timeline, but rather it occurs much after. The Lord has promised him that his people would be multiplied. And so in verse 16 we read, "For men verily swear by the greater, and oath for confirmation is to them an end of all strife. Wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath." We have the promise of God, and then we have the oath of God already just within the span of a few verses. That by two immutable things, the promise and oath, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation. Here's the bit that I really want. I know some of you are ahead of me already, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. Faith allows us to tie and secure and anchor our hope in something that is much greater than the temporal experiences that often plague our lives here in this world. Faith allows us to rest our hope in something greater than just the promise of a pleasant existence here in the world where there's no evil and everything unfolds precisely according to plan. That's simply not the way that life works. But rather, we have a strong consolation and a hope that's an anchor of the soul. Say, Habakkuk says that he's downtrodden. He's downcast. He's despairing. He's sad. He doesn't understand what's unfolding before him. But rather, Paul says, we have this hope that is an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast, which entereth into that within the veil. That is, faith allows us to visualize. It allows us to visualize a time beyond this life where evil doesn't seem to continually be able to prevail. And it's a visualization that allows